Daniel Carter walked into his son's elementary school cafeteria, still wearing grease-stained work boots, and the first sentence he heard was a 10-year-old telling the whole table his father was too busy fixing toilets to matter. He'd almost missed it entirely. His phone rang at 12:15 with the school's number on the screen. Family lunch day, something Noah had mentioned weeks that Daniel had let slip straight past him. Lunch started in 15 minutes. He was across town, elbow deep in a stranger's broken heating unit, tools scattered across the basement floor. He didn't finish the job. He grabbed his keys and left $340 in parts sitting where they were. By the time he pushed through the cafeteria doors, he hadn't changed his clothes, grease on his sleeves, sawdust in his hair, tool belt still hanging off one hip. He didn't care how he looked. He was only looking for Noah. He didn't know his son had been sitting alone for 6 minutes already, watching the entrance every few seconds. He didn't know a boy named Tyler had just asked Noah, loud enough for 3 tables to hear, what his dad actually did for a living. He didn't know Noah had answered honestly, he fixes things, and gotten laughed at for it. Daniel was still scanning the room when the laughter reached him first. "At least your dad actually showed up." He stopped mid-step. Underneath that laugh was a second voice, smaller, trying too hard to sound like it didn't hurt. It was Noah's. "If this channel means something to you, help me reach 50 subscribers. It matters more than you know. Because in the next 4 minutes, before this lunch period ended for good, a man in work boots was about to teach a room full of parents and children something none of them expected to learn from someone they'd already decided they understood." Noah had turned 5 the year his mother passed. 4 years later, he still remembered small details about his mother that Daniel didn't have the heart to correct. The color of a coat, a song she used to hum, things that had blurred slightly in Daniel's own memory, but stayed sharp in his son's. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Denver, rent $1,150 a month, a number Daniel had memorized the way other men memorized sports scores. Mornings ran the same way every day. Pancakes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, eggs the rest of the week, a lunch packed with more snacks than any 10-year-old needed, because Noah always swore he'd be starving by noon. Daniel worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, repairing heating systems, appliances, small engines, whatever paid and whatever didn't wait. He'd learned the trade from his own father, a man who used to say that anything built by human hands could be understood by human hands if you were patient enough to actually look at it. Daniel believed that more than he believed most things. He never talked about money in front of Noah. He never talked about being tired either, even on nights he came home at 8 with his knuckles split open from a stuck bolt. He kept a folder in the kitchen drawer with every bill sorted by due date, and he kept a second folder nobody saw, filled with drawings Noah had made for him since he was 6, a hero with a wrench instead of a cape, a house with 3 stick figures, even though there had only been 2 of them for 4 years now. People who hired Daniel for repair work rarely asked what he did before this. They saw a man in work boots who showed up on time, fixed the problem, and charged less than he probably should have. Most never asked how a man learned to rebuild a furnace motor at 2 a.m. without a manual, or why his hands moved with the kind of precision that usually took decades of formal training to develop. They just assumed he was good at his job and left it at that. Daniel never corrected the assumption. It had never mattered before. He didn't think about it walking through the cafeteria doors that Thursday either. He wasn't thinking about anything except getting to Noah before the moment passed him by completely. He didn't know yet that it had already had, and that what came next would matter more than either of them understood. Daniel crossed the last few feet to Noah's table, and the laughter died the way laughter does when someone realizes they'd been overheard. Tyler noticed him first,
the boots, the grease, the tool belt still hanging off one hip, and something flickered across his face, quick and dismissive, before he leaned toward the boy next to him and said it loud enough for the whole table to catch. "Guess the repair guy finally showed up." A few kids laughed, not all of them. Enough. Daniel didn't answer right away. He pulled out the empty chair beside Noah, the one that had been sitting there for 6 minutes, doing more damage than any of the kids at that table realized, and sat down like nothing had happened. "Sorry I'm late, buddy," he said. Noah's shoulders dropped, just slightly, the way a person's does when they've been holding something tight without knowing it. "You came." Wouldn't miss it. A mother 2 seats down, sharp blazer, phone still in one hand, glanced at Daniel's sleeves and then at her own son, an expression crossing her face that she didn't bother hiding. She leaned over and murmured something to the father beside her, and though Daniel couldn't hear the words, he understood the tone. He'd heard that tone in hardware stores, in waiting rooms, in the parking lots of houses he was about to fix furnaces in. It didn't need translation. Tyler kept going, emboldened now that an adult audience had joined. "My dad says most repair guys can't even afford the neighborhoods they work in." He looked at Noah. "Is that true?" Noah's ears went red. He stared down at his tray and said nothing. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, but his face didn't change. He'd spent years being underestimated in exactly this way, by exactly this kind of confidence, and he learned a long time ago that reacting to it only fed it. What none of them noticed, not Tyler, not the mother with the sharp blazer, not even Noah, was the man sitting 2 tables away who'd gone very quiet the moment Daniel sat down. He wasn't a parent. He wore a suit that cost more than Daniel's truck, and he'd been watching the room the way people watch things they're deciding whether to interrupt. He hadn't said anything yet, but he was staring directly at Daniel like he recognized him from somewhere neither Tyler nor anyone else at that table could begin to guess. The man in the suit was Marcus Whitfield, though nobody at that table would learn his name for another few minutes. He sat with his own daughter, a quiet girl named Priya, who'd been picking at her lunch tray without saying much, and he hadn't looked away from Daniel since the moment he sat down. Marcus ran Whitfield Dynamics, a manufacturing firm with contracts across 4 states, and he'd spent the last 3 months trying to solve a problem his own engineering team couldn't fix, a recurring failure in a cooling system installed across 6 of his facilities, one that had already cost the company $2.1 million in downtime. He'd flown in 2 consultants from Chicago. Neither had found the source. He was fairly certain he was looking at the man who had. 8 months earlier, Marcus's brother-in-law had called him half-panicked during a February storm, his restaurant's entire heating system dead on the coldest night of the year. Every commercial repair company in Denver backed up for days. Someone had given him a number for a guy who did emergency work. That guy showed up at midnight, diagnosed a failure nobody else caught in under 20 minutes, and had the system running again before sunrise. He'd never met him. He'd only heard the story secondhand, retold at a family dinner with the kind of details you remember. Grease-stained boots, calm hands, a habit of explaining exactly what he was doing without being asked. He was fairly certain the man across the cafeteria was the same one. Marcus didn't say anything yet. He watched Tyler needle Noah again, watched Daniel's face stay level and unreadable, and felt something close to embarrassment on behalf of every well-dressed parent in that room who had no idea what they were looking at. Priya tugged his sleeve. "Dad, you're staring." "I know," Marcus said quietly. He pulled his phone under the table and typed a name into the search bar, the one his brother-in-law had mentioned once, almost in passing, Daniel Carter. 3 results came up: a repair listing with a phone number, a 5-star review thread with over 200 entries, most of them describing the same thing in different words: showed up fast, fixed what nobody else could, charged less than he should have. Marcus set the phone face down on the table. He didn't yet know why a man capable of that kind of work was sitting in an $1,150 a month's apartment's version of a cafeteria seat, quietly absorbing insults from a 10-year-old. Priya tugged his sleeve. "Dad, you're staring." "I know," Marcus said quietly. He pulled his phone under the table and typed a name into the search bar, the one his brother-in-law had mentioned once, almost in passing, Daniel Carter. 3 results came up: a repair listing with a phone number, a 5-star review thread with over 200 entries, most of them describing the same thing in different words: showed up fast, fixed what nobody else could, charged less than he should have. Marcus set the phone face down on the table. He didn't yet know why a man capable of that kind of work was sitting in an $1,150 a month's apartment's version of a cafeteria seat, quietly absorbing insults from a 10-year-old. Priya tugged his sleeve. "Dad, you're staring." "I know," Marcus said quietly.
Marcus didn't approach right away. He watched Daniel reach into a paper bag and pull out a small drone, watched the table go quiet the way rooms do when something unexpected happens, and understood exactly what he was seeing before anyone else at that table did. He'd read about drone diagnostics buried somewhere in that 5-star review thread the night before, a customer describing how Daniel had rebuilt a commercial drone's guidance system for a fraction of the manufacturer's replacement cost. He watched Tyler's face shift from smirk to genuine curiosity in under 10 seconds, and he watched Noah sit up a little straighter, like something long held tight in his chest had finally loosened. By the time the teacher walked over and thanked Daniel for the heating repair, and the first parent recognized his name, Marcus already had his phone out again, this time typing a message to his head of engineering. "Found someone. Might be exactly what we need. We'll confirm today." He waited until the small crowd around Daniel's table thinned, until Tyler had mumbled his apology and Noah had accepted it the way kids do, quickly and without needing an audience for it. Then Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked over. "Mr. Carter, I don't think we've met." Daniel looked up, still holding the drone's remote. "Don't believe we have." Marcus introduced himself, watched Daniel's expression stay exactly the same, polite, unbothered, not a flicker of recognition at the company name, which told Marcus something important. This man had no idea what Whitfield Dynamics was, and clearly didn't care that he was talking to someone whose net worth was somewhere north of $80 million. "I think you fixed my brother-in-law's restaurant heating system in February, during the storm." Daniel nodded slowly. "Corner of 6th and Larimer. Compressor had frozen solid." Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a mix of relief and something closer to disbelief. That's the one. He didn't launch into the pitch right there in the cafeteria, in front of Noah, in front of a room that had just watched this man handle public humiliation with more composure than most executives Marcus had sat across a boardroom table from. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Would you have 20 minutes this week? I've got a problem at one of my plants nobody's been able to solve, and I have a feeling you might already know what it is before I finish explaining it." Daniel glanced at Noah, who was watching the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure what any of it meant yet. "I can make time, so long as it doesn't interfere with pickup." The plant was 40 minutes north of Denver, a manufacturing facility the size of 6 football fields, humming with machinery that made Daniel's usual jobs look like toy repairs by comparison. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the same truck he always drove, in the same boots, and the receptionist at the front desk looked at his work clothes for a beat too long before buzzing him through. Marcus met him personally, which the 2 engineers waiting in the hallway clearly hadn't. Expected. One of the men, a man named Grant Pilson, who'd flown in from Chicago twice already at $4,200 a day, barely hid his skepticism. "You're the repair guy." Not quite a question. "I fix things. That's usually enough." They walked him to cooling line 4, the system that had failed 11 times in 3 months, each failure costing the plant somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000 in downtime. Grant explained the diagnostics they'd already run, the parts they'd already replaced, the software patch a different consulting firm had installed at $180,000 that hadn't fixed anything. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he asked to see the system itself, not the reports. He spent the first 20 minutes just watching it run, hands in his pockets, saying almost nothing. Grant exchanged a glance with another engineer that Daniel caught but didn't react to. He'd seen that glance before, in dozens of rooms just like this one. Then Daniel crouched near a junction box most of the reports hadn't mentioned at all, listened to something under the hum of the machinery that nobody else seemed to notice, and asked a single question. How old is this relay panel? Nobody knew offhand. Someone checked. 14 years. Daniel explained, in plain terms, that the panel wasn't failing from a manufacturing defect or a software patch at all. It was failing because of a timing mismatch between the old relay system and the newer software patch layered on top of it, a conflict that would show as random and unrelated failures precisely because nobody had thought to check whether the old and new systems were actually built to talk to each other in the first place. Grant went quiet. Marcus asked how long it would take to confirm. Daniel said he could test it within the hour if someone brought him a multimeter and let him work. 90 minutes later, cooling line 4 ran a full cycle without a single failure for the first time in 3 months. Marcus stood in the control room watching the readout and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Grant. "Get me contracts ready, tonight."
Word moved through Whitfield Dynamics faster than Marcus expected. By Thursday morning, 3 other plant managers had heard some version of the story. The repair guy who found in 90 minutes what a $180,000 consulting contract couldn't fix in 3 months. And each of them had a system they suddenly wanted looked at. Grant Pilson, to his credit, didn't try to downplay what happened. He told Marcus directly that he'd misjudged the situation from the moment Daniel walked in, and that the 14-year-old relay panel had been sitting in his own diagnostic notes the entire time, flagged and then dismissed, because nobody on his team believed a compatibility issue that basic could explain failures that expensive. Marcus offered Daniel a formal consulting contract that Friday, $340 an hour, exclusive access across all 6 facilities, plus a signing bonus large enough that Daniel read the number twice before responding. It was more money than he'd made in the previous 8 months combined. Daniel didn't accept immediately. He asked for a day to think about it, which surprised Marcus more than the fix itself had. "Most people don't hesitate on an offer like this," Marcus said. "I've got a kid who needs picking up at 3:15, Daniel said. "Whatever I agree to has to work around that first." Marcus adjusted the terms without being asked twice. Flexible hours, remote diagnostics where possible, travel limited to 2 days a week. He'd learned in the space of one meeting that the man's priorities weren't negotiable the way most executives were. Word reached Tyler's father, Robert Ainsworth, through an entirely different channel, a business associate who mentioned, almost in passing, that Whitfield Dynamics had just signed an exclusive consulting deal with a repair technician who'd solved a 7-figure problem in an afternoon. Robert asked the man's name out of idle curiosity. When he heard Daniel Carter, he went quiet for a moment longer than the conversation called for. He hadn't been at family lunch day. He'd heard about it from Tyler secondhand, framed the way a 10-year-old frames things. Some kid's dad showed up late in dirty clothes. He hadn't thought about it since. Now he sat at his desk, running the 2 facts side by side in his head, unable to make them fit together the way he wanted them to. He picked up his phone and called Tyler's school, asking in a voice that had lost some of its usual certainty whether he could get the name of another parent of Thursday's event. He had a feeling he already knew who owned every open contract Whitfield Dynamics was about to be worth. Robert Ainsworth found out everything within a week, and none of it came from Daniel directly. It came from a mutual colleague at a logistics conference who mentioned, almost in passing, that Whitfield Dynamics had just quietly extended Daniel Carter's consulting contract to include predictive maintenance work across all 6 plants, a deal now worth an estimated $1.4 million over 3 years. It came from Marcus himself at a dinner Robert hadn't realized Daniel would also be attending, where he introduced him simply as the reason cooling line 4 still runs, no further explanation offered or needed. Robert sat 2 seats down from a man his own son had mocked in a school cafeteria 3 weeks earlier and said almost nothing all evening. He thought about calling Daniel afterward, rehearsing something that might sound like an apology without quite committing to being one. He never made the call. Some part of him understood that an apology addressed to a grown man wasn't really the one that mattered here.
The one that mattered happened at home on a Tuesday night when Tyler mentioned offhand that a classmate's dad had gotten some big contract with a manufacturing company and asked half-jokingly if Noah's family was rich now. Robert set down his fork. "Do you remember what you said to him at lunch?" Tyler shrugged, the particular shrug of a kid who genuinely didn't think it mattered anymore. "I didn't ask that." Tyler went quiet, trying to recall the exact words, embarrassed now a different way than he'd been at the cafeteria table. Robert didn't lecture him long. He didn't need to. He simply told his son that the man he'd laughed at for fixing toilets had just solved a problem worth more money than Robert's own company had made in profit the previous year, and that the lesson wasn't about the money at all. "It's that you judged what he had before you ever asked what he could do," Robert said. "That's the part I need you to remember, not the number." Tyler nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant something was actually landing. Meanwhile, at school, something had already shifted without either family fully realizing it. Noah's classmates had started asking him questions instead of jokes, what his dad actually worked on now, whether the drone story was true, whether he could bring it in for show and tell. Noah answered every question the same simple way his father always had. "He fixes things," he said. No one laughed this time.
By spring, Daniel's consulting work with Whitfield Dynamics had expanded into something he hadn't planned and hadn't asked for either. Marcus started referring him to 2 other manufacturing companies struggling with similar problems, and within 4 months, Daniel was earning more from 3 days a week of diagnostic work than he'd earned working 6 days a week for 15 years straight. He didn't quit repair work entirely. He still took emergency calls on weekends, still charged less than he probably should have. When Marcus asked him once why he kept doing it, Daniel said simply that the people calling him at midnight during a storm needed the help more than the plants did during business hours, and that was reason enough. He moved himself and Noah into a slightly bigger apartment that fall. Nothing extravagant, just an extra room and a yard big enough for the drone to fly properly. He kept the folder of Noah's drawings in the same kitchen drawer. He added a new one to it a few weeks after the cafeteria, Noah's crayon rendering of a man in a tool belt standing next to a stick-figure drone titled in careful 10-year-old handwriting, "My Dad Fixes Everything." Eventually, Marcus offered Daniel a full-time engineering director position, salary well into 6 figures. Daniel turned it down, the same as he'd turned down 2 similar offers since, explaining that a desk job would take him further from the actual work, and the actual work was the part he'd never been willing to give up. Tyler and Noah ended up in the same after-school robotics club that spring, an accident of scheduling neither family had planned. Tyler asked Daniel, the first time he came to pick up Noah, if he could show him how the drone's motor actually worked. Daniel spent 20 minutes explaining it, patient the same way he was with every question anyone ever asked him, and Tyler listened like it was the most interesting thing he'd heard all year. Robert never gave a public apology, and Daniel never asked for one. Some things didn't need to be said out loud to be understood. Years later, when people asked Daniel how his life changed after that cafeteria, he never mentioned the contract, the money, or the recognition. He talked about a 10-year-old boy who'd sat alone at a lunch table for 6 minutes, waiting for someone to show up. "That's the only part that mattered," he'd say. "Everything after that was just people finally catching up to what was already true."